want to scare you, and I'm welcome all of you, all the brave people who came out despite the thunder and lightning I've seen outside while I was driving here. So good evening. My name is Ruth von Bernuth, and I'm the director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 9th annual Sylvia and Irving Margolis Lecture on the Jewish Experience in the American South. Before I welcome the Margolis family and give Yaakov Ariel, the Associate Director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Study, the floor, and he will be introducing our distinguished speaker of tonight, Dana Kaplan, let me first thank the extended Margolis family. The Margolis lectureship was made possible by a generous gift from Alan and Gail Fields and Gary and Sandra Smiley. The lectureship honors Gail and Sandra's parents, Irving and Sylvia Margolis. Alan and Gail Fields and Gary and Sandra Smiley are here tonight, along with Seth and Ali Pinoski, great-grandchildren of Irving and Sylvia. Please, maybe you can show, and then Ali is a senior and Seth is a first-year student, so we are very happy to have them here at UNC. The center was established 13 years ago, and we have a growing number of majors and minors in Jewish studies and Hebrew, and also a number of graduate students who are affiliated with the center, as well as a growing number of faculty members. We are looking forward to welcome our 22nd faculty member in fall. We have offered over 30 courses per academic year in the field of Jewish studies in recent years. In the future, we look forward to building a program that serves the needs of our remarkable students, with even more opportunities for student research, even more courses taught by more faculty, and graduate fellowships that help Carolina recruit the very best students in the nation to pursue their doctoral training in Chapel Hill. Tonight's lecture is also the last event of the academic year 2014-15. But don't worry, we are currently planning and working on the program for next year with more events. And I can tell you already that the next Margolis lecture is set for November. We are also planning a conference on anti-Semitism open to students, faculty, and the general public next April. So please mark this into your calendar. Our next newsletter will have more details, but please check our webpage as well, jewishstudies.unc.edu, for upcoming events. Major gifts have played an important role in what we've been able to accomplish over the years, but so has annual giving, and we owe a great debt to all the alumni and friends who have supported us. Please know how grateful we are for the inspiring support for Jewish studies that our alumni and friends have shown us over the last 13 years. And please know what a tremendous difference your continued support will make in the next years. And now I welcome Yaakov Ariel.
Thank you again, everyone, for coming. Thank the donors again. It was a pleasure to meet the extended family. And as Ruth von Bernuth has said, this is a night that you have come in spite of fire, thunderstorm, floods, and tsunamis. Dana Kaplan is introduced in the various advertisements as Rabbi Dana Kaplan, and that is very true. He's been a rabbi in South Africa, in Georgia, in Jamaica. But Dana Kaplan is also Dr. Dana Kaplan, a graduate of the University of Tel Aviv, who has done research on a history of the Jews in Cuba, in South Africa, in the American South, and extensive research of the Reform movement throughout history and in our time. He published a whole series of books on the Reform movement. Some of you might be familiar with his publications. He also published a book on renewal and changes and renewal in American Jewry in the last generation that was published just a few years ago by Columbia University Press. In fact, I think that I'm not exaggerating in any way if I'll tell you that Rabbi Professor Kaplan, is the expert on Reform Judaism. He's also the expert on the history of conversion to Judaism in the late modern era. He wrote his doctoral dissertation, a very original one, at Tel Aviv University, on how there have been always converts to Judaism in small numbers, but historically, since the Middle Ages, Jews were very reluctant to convert, and the hosting societies were very reluctant to allow Jews to convert. And so the concept, the social phenomenon, the cultural phenomenon, the religious phenomenon of moving from Christianity to Judaism is very much a product of the 19th-century American South. This was Dr. Rabbi Kaplan's dissertation. This is a topic he's well familiar with. And I'm very, very happy that Rabbi Kaplan is incidentally the rabbi of the one and only Jewish community in Kingston, Jamaica. And just the name can show you what an historical and unique place this is. And he's come all the way by boat, plane, rail, hitchhiking, horses, etc., arriving tonight to deliver his lecture. So without further ado, Rabbi Dr. Kaplan.
It's a pleasure to be here. Can you all hear me okay? Thank you for coming. And I know there's a potential storm brewing, or there's an actual storm brewing. But that doesn't frighten me because Kingston has suffered earthquakes and hurricanes and all sorts of natural disasters over the last couple hundred years. So we're ready, right? Good evening and welcome. I chose Professor Ariel asked me to address the issue of crossing the boundary from Gentile to Jew, specifically in the 19th century American South, because it has a lot of importance for the history of American Judaism, and the South played, as you know, a tremendous role in this process. Let me just ask a couple of short questions, and just raise your hands if you would. How many people here tonight are born in the South? Very few. Wait, but let me repeat that question. How many were born in the South? Not just here in Chapel Hill, but in the South, anywhere in the South. Southern California counts. And then I was going to follow that with how many are born in Chapel Hill, but I don't think we're going to have even a couple. How many were born in Chapel Hill? Interesting. How many are members of a synagogue? How many are of those who are members of a synagogue? And don't cheat. If you let your dues lapse 25 years ago, it doesn't count. How many are members of a Reform synagogue? Conservative? Reconstructionist? Orthodox? Orthodox? Going once, going twice. So the group who are Orthodox Jews born in Chapel Hill, wow. Fascinating. I'm going to do the sociological study of this group here tonight, and you'll see in about 5 years a big article in the Jewish Journal of Sociology. I'm from Kingston, Jamaica. I've lived there for the last 4 years. And just a couple of words, since I know you're going to want to know, is about Jewish life there and about how I got there. I was going to joke with you and say that I robbed a few banks and had to leave my previous pulpit in Albany, Georgia. But then you'd ask me, well, why am I back in the States if I'm a fugitive from American justice? So I won't use that joke, which is probably not funny anyway. but I just decided to embark in an adventure. They were looking for the first rabbi in 33 years, absence of a rabbi since 1970s, where you may have known that Jamaica elected in 1972 Prime Minister Michael Manley, and that precipitated a tremendous social and political crisis in Jamaica, leading to the exodus of virtually the entire middle and upper class, and with it the last of the Jamaican rabbis until me. And so I thought that would be, they say that rabbis who take over after a long-serving rabbi have a lot of trouble, and I didn't think that would apply to a rabbi taking over after a long absence of no rabbi, because, certainly if I'm, a little bit better than zero, then I'm something, right? But it has had its challenges, among them just navigating through the city, which has got tremendous potholes, and we're talking about potholes, that your entire car can disappear into one of those holes if you're not careful. And so when I came, I'd always wanted one of those little mini motors, the little British ones. And they said, Rabbi, no, you cannot get one of those. You need a big SUV to survive the potholes. And they were definitely right. We are one of the 4 sand floor synagogues in the Caribbean, Kingston, Jamaica, and the other 3 are Curacao, St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Curacao and Suriname, which is in the northern part of South America. And those 4 were, and several others that no longer exist, and a few others that still exist, but they did away with their sand floors, were all founded and settled by Spanish-Portuguese Jews escaping from the Inquisition. And they settled in Jamaica, first in Port Royal, which is just on the other side of the airport on this very narrow islet. And that was known as the wickedest city in the West. And I'm not responsible for that. But until there was a massive earthquake, and most of the city sunk into the water, where it remains unexcavated to this day. So our synagogue has actual sand on the floor. Our building is about 102, 103 years old, but the congregation traces its roots more than 360 years. And originally, as I'll refer to in a couple of minutes, I'd say our congregation was very similar to the first 5 American synagogues. You may know before the Revolution there were 5 well-established Jewish congregations in the U.S., and they were so unified that when George Washington was elected president, they wanted to send a letter wishing him Mazal Tov. They couldn't agree on the text, so they sent 2 separate letters. And these were, let me see if when you fly, you lose your memory, but the 5 are New York, Philadelphia, sounds northern so far, Newport, Rhode Island, Charleston, and Savannah. And then after the Revolution, there was a lull in immigration. So between 1776 and 1820, 1830, there was only 1 synagogue established in the entire, what was then the young United States, which was also in the South. Anyone know where? Right. Oh, wow. Okay. So, Richmond, Virginia. And I asked that question so I know, so I have to be on my toes now, because obviously that gentleman who knew the answer to that is going to be watching what I say very carefully. I want to describe for you 4 specific cases or controversies relating to conversions, going from the Revolutionary War period up to the very end of the 19th century. But first, I wanted to briefly ask a question. Allen Fields, right? and I were sitting next to each other just a few minutes ago at dinner at the Carolina Inn, where I was eating the most delicious, delicious dinner that Professor Ariel pre-ordered for me. Very, very well done. And I asked him, he's a transplant from Brooklyn, which I believe is somewhere in the New York area. I'm from Manhattan, so I've been to Brooklyn very few times, and I don't think I could really identify it in photographs, but he tells me he's from Brooklyn, and I believe him. And I said to him, is Judaism in the South, in your experience, he's obviously 21st century person and maybe a little bit into the 20th century, but not 19th century at all. But I asked him, is the Judaism that you experienced in the North intrinsically different from the Judaism that you experienced in the South? And he said, very much so. And we engaged in just in a couple minutes in a discussion of what that might include. And, you know, he pointed out the differences in how the surrounding society looked at Jews, which was quite different, and possibly the church influence was heavier, and maybe the African American served as a foil for people's antagonism. There's all sorts of theories. But that is the first question that I'm asked, and remember that as a guest speaker tonight, I'm just here to ask questions and raise provocative issues, not to solve anything or to give you conclusive answers. But the question I would ask is, were the Southern Jews like everyone else? Or were they somehow intrinsically different? And if they were like everyone else, does that mean they were like everyone else, all the other Southerners, or all the other Jews? So is a Southern Jew like a Northern Jew, or is a Southern Jew like a Southerner of any other faith? And this has been a question that has been asked periodically by various historians for quite a long time. One historian concluded that everywhere the Jew is the eternal alien, and in the South especially so. On the other hand, another historian found that Jews in the South are not aliens in a promised land, but blood and bones part of the South itself, truly Jewish Southerners. Abraham Peck of the University of Maine at Augusta, and you could say, well, what does a professor from Maine know about Southern Judaism? At least I'm in the South, technically, sort of. But Abraham Peck, a wonderful guy, has referred to 19th century Southern Judaism as that other peculiar institution. And Peck argued that Southern Jews created their own version of a myth of nobility, which paralleled that of Southern Christian neighbors. And according to Peck, they did this in part because they were never fully accepted into Southern white upper-class society. They or we were tolerated and subjected to relatively very little overt discrimination, but also not fully accepted as brothers and sisters, as social equals. And so, left to our own devices, we invented our own myth of social superiority, which in large part related back to Spanish-Portuguese heritage, to compensate for the social doors that were blocked. Others, such as Mark Baumann of the Atlanta Metropolitan College, argue that Southern Jews were influenced by regional subculture in a relatively marginal way. In his view, there was very little that was unique in the Jewish experience in the Southern United States. Rather, their experiences, or our experiences, were far more similar to Jews in other similar environments elsewhere in America than they were to white Protestants in the South. Now, having lived in Albany, Georgia, and Georgians like to take words, names of cities from other places, and then we pronounce it in our own unique way. So what the founder of Albany, Nelson Tiff, named Albany, Georgia, after Albany, New York, where he had lived, but Albany, New York became Albany, Georgia, and we have Cairo, Georgia, which is not pronounced Cairo, and several other regional pronunciations of that type. But I can see it both ways. In my experience, in some ways, our Judaism in Georgia was just like in the North, and in other ways, it was completely different. So I guess it's like the half glass, the glass that's half full, half empty, although I poured a little too much water, and so this glass is clearly more than half full, but I guess we want to be optimists, right? Now, let me move to the topic of conversion, which is, you may say, conversion in the 19th century. Was there any? Has anyone thought that when they were parking their cars? One brave person admits to that. Well, it was very common, much more common than you might think. Rabbi Bernard Iloui of New Orleans wrote in 1865, let me just quote you, "There is perhaps no country in the world where the Hebrew communities are so frequently increased by numbers of proselytes as in this country. And our transatlantic brethren must surely, when they learn from the different American Jewish periodicals these happy tidings, greatly rejoice and think the time of the advent of the Messiah is nigh. Truth commences to dawn over the Gentiles and break the long night of ignorance and superstition, and fill their hearts as prophesied with the fear of God and the true knowledge of his unity." And Samuel Meyer Isaacs, a Jewish journalist, echoed Iloui's comments. "What must our European Israelites think when they see published that a Christian lady and 4 children have left the church for the synagogue, or that the eyes of the congregation were bedimmed with tears when they beheld a Christian female hearing her repeat the Shema? They must imagine that Judaism is indeed prospering when so many volunteer to abandon the church for the synagogue." Now, both of these gentlemen go on in their respective essays to express some degree of concern and skepticism about the nature of the phenomena. They're both worried that it's a gender-specific phenomena, in other words, that it's mostly women, and they're doing so mostly for what they would have regarded as an ulterior motive, which was okay. And both of them are Orthodox, of which we don't have any Orthodox representatives here with us tonight, so you wouldn't know about that, but that would sort of color their perspectives. Now, as you probably know, the first known convert in the Bible is Ruth. And Ruth is a daughter-in-law of Naomi, and she marries, in fact, one of Naomi's sons. But it's only after the son passes away that she makes her famous declaration, "Your God is my God, your people are my people," and she basically, as far as we can understand, converts herself in the first recorded conversion of history. And the process of conversion, which seems to have always been quite common, is very poorly documented for the first several hundred years of Jewish history. There's references, Abraham and his wife Sarah are the first converts and the first Jews, and they gather around them a following who are presumably the first people to convert to Judaism. But they didn't use those terms, and there certainly were none of the characteristics that we come to later associate with conversion. But by the rabbinic period, you have one basic requirement, which is the acceptance of Kabbalat, or the idea of Kabbalat mitzvot, the acceptance of the commandments. And of course, everything is dependent on how you interpret the acceptance of the commandments. So you could say, how many mitzvot are there in the Torah? So we could say, you want to convert, you've got to prove to me you're doing all 613 commandments, which is unfortunately impossible today because there's no temple and all of this. But you could say you have to be strict on everything, or virtually everything. But that's not the attitude taken in the Talmud, where the rabbis said we're going to ask the prospective proselyte to do a few of the harder ones and a few of the easier ones, and if they show a willingness in principle to commit to those, then we'll convert them. And the conversion would involve, for men, Brit Milah, and for men and women, Tevilah, and it had to be supervised by a Beit Din, and then you have a new Jew. And the Talmud is very clear that once a person converts, you're not supposed to remind them of their conversion because they're accepted as a Jew like everyone else. That was necessary because people did remind people that they'd converted, not always in a bad way, but Avadia Hager, the Avadia, the convert, was corresponding with Maimonides, for example. And they just identified him that way in order to make it clear who he was, and also because the nature of the correspondence had specifically to do with conversion. Now, we know also that Judaism was almost certainly originally a missionary religion, and we only stopped that as a result of pressure from Christianity. And once Christianity became the official religion of Rome, it became a capital crime to participate in a conversion either as the convert or the supervising rabbi. And it's dangerous enough being a rabbi today without having to risk capital punishment. You could laugh. I'm sorry. I once had a confirmation student, and I said, Eli, I'm going to, over the summer, go and take a humor course. And he said, how long is it for? He said, I said, a week. I was trying to be funny, and he looked at me very sadly. He said, Rabbi, I don't think that's going to be nearly long enough. But I try. But conversion is a barometer for how secure we feel in a society. If we feel very insecure in a very anti-Semitic environment, we're not going to want to go out there and, quote-unquote, preach the gospel because we're going to be worried about our own skins. The more accepted we feel, and in the United States today, I think it's very safe to say that we have never, ever been as accepted, as loved as we are in America today. I mean, they can't make a TV show without throwing in a whole host of Jewish references. And so I think that hand in hand with that goes an acceptance of embracing non-Jews. And I was leading a faculty seminar for the Research Triangle yesterday, and we talked about how that has really gone to far beyond what we imagined. But when I think you could summarize that and say, when Jews feel secure, we welcome converts. When we are in retreat, the tendency is to oppose conversion. And you see both of these tendencies in various Jewish texts, in various Jewish periods. Now, the first case that I'd like to get to is at any time between 1776 and 1820. And as you will recall, there are 5 synagogues, Spanish Portuguese, and these congregations are very similar to the congregation that I'm rabbi of in Kingston. And the Spanish-Portuguese Jews went through a lot and were forced to convert to Catholicism and returned to Judaism after an extended period of being secret Jews. Anusim in Hebrew, the forced ones, conversos in Spanish, the converted ones, also derogatorily called marranos or pigs because of resentment from the old Christians who felt the new Christians were an economic and political threat to them. And so these congregations, once established in the New World, were very reluctant to embrace the whole principle of conversion. There were also no ordained rabbis up until about 1840 in the United States. The first really ordained rabbi that we know about is Abraham Rice of Baltimore, who I believe arrived in 1840. And there were a few very learned people in Philadelphia in particular, but they were not. They didn't have the rabbinic authority that maybe was hoped for. And so that was one problem. But more broadly speaking, they just didn't want, this is our community, we've gone through a lot together, and we want to keep that community together. We're not interested in bringing in outsiders. We're secure in the United States, it's 1776, but not so secure that we want to start doing funny things by bringing non-Jews in. We don't know what the impact of that might be, and we'd rather not fiddle with it. And so, but the affairs of the heart have no boundary, and you started to have relationships, and many of the relationships led to marriage, and some of the cases of marriage, the Jewish partner said to the non-Jewish partner, like today, I'd like you to join my religion. In many other cases, the Jewish partner said, I don't really care, or I don't want to perpetuate this, and so I may not convert to Christianity, but I'm just going to sit quietly on Sunday, you take the kids to church, and we'll raise our family as Christians, and we'll fit in better. And but not everyone said that. Now, who said what? It's how people make Jewish decisions in their lives is something that sociologists are trying to figure out. What are the factors that influence us one way or another? And from the perspective of 200 years later, it's very hard to reconstruct. But in one case, there was a woman named Anne Sarah Irby, and she lived in Charleston, South Carolina, and she was a French Huguenot background. And according to the family story, during the siege of Charleston, right? Did you study that in your southern elementary schools that you all attended? She fainted during the siege of Charleston when a British shell exploded right near her. And she was comforted and brought back to life by a young man named Abraham Alexander. And as soon as she opened her eyes, she saw him, and you saved my life, she cried, and they fell in love, and they decided to marry in 1784. And the family's oral traditions describe her becoming strictly observant, following Jewish law in a rigorous manner, and she found some ritual functionary to convert her. But her husband had been the volunteer chazan, which doesn't mean cantor in this context, but sort of volunteer rabbi, and the congregation forced him to resign his position, even though his wife had converted. They allowed the couple to be members, and they were, and tragically, 19 years later, she passed away. And suddenly, the board of the synagogue had a problem. Now, she had, of course, requested in her will that she be buried in the Beit Elohim cemetery, which Beit Elohim was the synagogue in Charleston. And her will expressed her faith in the Almighty God of Israel, my Creator. And she also records her desire to be buried with as little expense as decency will permit. All very Jewish sentiments. But nevertheless, the Congregational Board, who had probably been salivating at this opportunity, refused her burial on the basis that there was an unnamed ceremonial omission in her conversion. Now, probably the ceremonial omission was that she was not converted by Beit Din of 3 ordained rabbis. The only problem with that is there were no ordained rabbis, not only in Charleston, but anywhere in the colonies. So it was kind of an excuse, and we don't know exactly where she's buried, probably in her family's Protestant cemetery, although we haven't been able to find her grave. Now, a similar case occurred in Richmond, Virginia, to Elizabeth Whitlock. And she married not one but 2 Jewish gentlemen, not at the same time. She was only a teenager when she met Moses Mordecai in England in 1755. They married in either 1760 or 1761, and then came to what was then the British colonies. And eventually they moved to Richmond, then they transferred to Philadelphia, where he passed away. And she remarried Jacob Cohen, and Jacob Cohen had a certain ritual status. Anybody guess what it was from the last name? Right. And what is the problem in halakha with such a marriage between Elizabeth and Jacob? Right, a Cohen can't marry a divorcee. But they did anyway, and they practiced Judaism, and the Cohens then moved back to Richmond, Virginia, where Jacob became a very prosperous merchant and made an endowment similar to the endowment that we have here tonight. And was a very good member of the Jewish community. But it didn't help, because when his wife passed away in 1804, again, the board of the synagogue said, we're not going to bury her, we're sorry. And in this case, unlike the first case, the husband was still alive to complain. And Jews love to complain, and especially you can imagine this is not just a minor complaint, this affects the final resting place of his beloved wife. But it didn't help, and again, they said no. Again, they cited an obscure problem with the conversion. And so what do you see from these and similar cases is a determination of the early Spanish-Portuguese synagogue to either refuse conversion outright or to try to ostracize those who converted and their spouses as much as possible. A second case out of 4 is a woman named Marie Bethelot, who was an orphan from a Catholic background, living in Louisiana, who married Jacob Lemon. And Jacob Lemon, it's pronounced Lemann. You may have heard of the journalist Nicholas Lemon, who writes for the New Yorker, and he's a great-great-grandson. And I wrote to him, and he wrote back, and he gave me a little bit more information about the family, which is quite interesting. The Lemons became one of the best-known families in Donaldsonville, Louisiana. Anybody ever been to Donaldsonville, Louisiana? No? Okay. And I don't know if you'll see any evidence of the Lemons there anymore, but in the 1830s and 1840s, they were the big mercantile family in town. And in the 1850s and 1860s, they expanded into activities in New Orleans, and Newport, Rhode Island, and New York. And then they moved to New York. Now, what's interesting is Marie, who'd been not raised a nominal Catholic, and they had a synagogue in Donaldsonville, she is sort of like Ruth. She converts herself, she adopts a religion, she starts practicing it without anyone having converted her because there's no rabbi there. And but in this case, she's accepted by the congregants, and she becomes part of the congregation, as far as I can tell, like everyone else, or even more so. And they live very happily. And then the 1850s come, and they move for a period to New York for economic reasons. And they realize that they're in New York. So they go to a few off-Broadway plays, and they see there's synagogues here. And the synagogues, some of the synagogues have rabbis, real rabbis. And they hear about a particular rabbi, who is Rabbi Max Lilienthal, who is still at this point nominally Orthodox, but is about to join Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise in Cincinnati and become his right-hand man in the building of the Reform movement. And Lilienthal is establishing a Beit Din to convert people, among other projects. So Marie calls him up and says, Rabbi, I've been practicing Judaism for 20 years, but I've never converted, and we're in New York for a while. Can you help me? And he says, sure, come on down. You're exactly the type of person I'm looking for. And very quickly, he doesn't really feel there's a lot of preparation necessary because she's been living a Jewish life for somewhere like 20 years. And so he converts her, gives her a Tudat Giur, and she's officially a Jew, an Orthodox Jew, for that matter. It's interesting because it's a different kind of congregation, right? It's an Ashkenazic instead of Sephardic, and it's maybe 40 or 50 years later than the other conversions, but completely different result. Third case is, we're going back to my friend Rabbi Bernard Louis, who I mentioned earlier, a very interesting early Orthodox rabbi in the United States. And Louis was very bright, but he was very rigid, and that was not a good thing to be in the United States in the 1850s, 1860s, where Judaism was developing. Just as an aside, many people believe that Reform Judaism started in Germany and was brought over by the German immigrants who came to the United States in the 1820s, 1830s, and so on. And this is not really the primary means of the development of American Reform Judaism, because these German immigrants, of whom some of them may be your great-great-grandparents, mostly came from very small towns in Germany where there was no Reform Judaism. So they may not have gotten a lot of Jewish education, but what they did get was pretty much traditional. They may have heard a little bit about what was going on in Hamburg and Berlin, but probably barely. But once they get to little towns and not so little towns, Fort Wayne, Indiana, or Chicago, Illinois, or any one of a couple of hundred other places, they came face to face with the realities of religious life in the New World. And they had to work on Saturday, or they felt they had to work on Saturday, and they couldn't get kosher meat. And there was all sorts of compromises that required some sort of an approach to religion that would be more applicable to the times. And that is apparently how the majority of what we call American Reform Judaism today started. Anyway, back to the story of Rabbi Louis in New Orleans. So because of his rigidity, he served quite a few pulpits during his career. And I know, but if I retire with half the number of his pulpits, I'll regard that as an unmitigated success. But he finds himself in New Orleans, and if it wasn't a good thing for him being so rigid to be in the U.S., period, it was a very bad idea to go to New Orleans, because if the U.S. was a pretty wild place, New Orleans was the wild of the wild. Not quite as wild as Port Royal in Jamaica, but close. And so, in fact, their first two spiritual leaders, they weren't really ordained, the first one was intermarried to a Catholic, a practicing Catholic, and he was possibly involved in a shootout. And when he died, his wife wanted to throw a crucifix into his coffin and had to be restrained by the other members of the Jewish community, of which she was part. And the second acting rabbi, not ordained, married a Jewish woman, but they didn't circumcise any of his sons. And I was also involved, apparently, in a shootout. There were a lot of shootouts at this time. But by 1864, there were less shootouts, but there was tons of intermarriage. And there were 3 Moalim in New Orleans at this time, and they were all circumcising the baby boys of Jewish fathers and Christian mothers. So if this reminds you of today, then it should, because it's a very similar situation, and we're going back quite a few years. And Rabbi Louis, worked hard to build up Judaism as he understood it in New Orleans. But what he did not want is this sort of behavior. So he tried to get people to increase their observance, to close their stores on Shabbat, to begin keeping kosher, to improve the congregation's religious education program. And he was very proud that he got 40 families in his congregation to build their own sukkot. So things were going well. And then in August 1864, he prohibits the 3 Moalim from circumcising these type of boys. If the mother is Christian and the father is Jewish, he said you cannot circumcise the baby boy. Now, 2 of the Moalim worked for his congregation, so they had no choice but to say, okay. The third one was a man named Charles Goldenberg, who worked for another synagogue, or with another synagogue, which was more liberal, if such a thing is possible in a New Orleans context. And Moel Goldenberg said to Rabbi Louis, tough luck. This is America. I will do what I want. It's a free country. And this became a huge, huge controversy. Louis wrote to all the European rabbis he could think of to get support. Goldenberg asked his board of directors for a vote of confidence, which they gave him, and the fight was on. And I won't go through the details of this, but what Louis was worried about is precisely what many of us might see as a positive result. That he was worried that you would then have these baby boys circumcised. They would grow up to identify as Jews, which is what you would think we want, right? And these young men would now, quote unquote, pass as Jews, and they'd marry whoever they'd marry and become members in their own right in some synagogue somewhere. But Louis didn't like that idea because halachically they're not Jewish, according to his understanding of that. And therefore, then you're going to have them called up for an aliyah to the Torah, and you will be calling up, technically a non-Jew, to do something that only a Jew's allowed to do. Which comes back to this question of barriers and boundaries and borders between, and of course we know in traditional Judaism that is the core element of Jewish theology, that we believe, or the traditional Jewish theology believes, that the Jews are a chosen people, that God chose us from among all the other people to give us the Torah and establish a special religious covenant between God and us, and only us. And that our goal or job in society is to then spread this divine wisdom as far as we can, but playing a role of God's special people and not assimilating among the nations. So Louis is basing his rejection on very strong grounds from a traditional theological point of view, but very weak grounds from a sociological point of view. And in the end, you can imagine that he lost, and he moved on to another congregation, and the Moels went on circumcising the children of anyone who asked them to do so. And some of them were raised as Jews, some of them not so much. It's very hard to trace, but in America it's very hard to control people's religious behavior. The final case is a fascinating one in its own right. I came across a number of years ago in the American Jewish Archives a series of letters written by a man, W.E. Todd. I guess his first name was probably William, but I don't know. And he was living in Tappahannock, a small town in Essex County, 40 miles northeast of Richmond, Virginia. And he had been in a number of Protestant sects, and he had not liked any of them. And so he writes to Rabbi Edward Kalish of Richmond, Virginia, and he says, I've lost my Christian faith, and I want to convert to Judaism. But he couples this with a specific request. He doesn't just want to convert to Judaism to become a congregant. He wants to convert to Judaism and then go on to study for the rabbinate at Hebrew Union College, which is my alma mater as well. And Kalish, who had been in Virginia for a long time and had overseen quite a number of conversions, although primarily of women looking to marry Jewish men, was not sure what to say to him, because it didn't just involve a conversion. If he converted Mr. Todd, he then has to help him to apply for rabbinical school. So he sends off a series of letters asking people for advice. And but meanwhile, before he can get the letters back, he writes back to Mr. Todd, and we don't have the letters from Kalish to Todd, but Kalish, being a very conscious rabbi, saved all of his correspondence in. This is before photocopy machines and certainly scanners and email, and so it's very frustrating, because if Rabbi Kalish had just splurged and bought a scanner, I would have so much more information to convey to you tonight. But you want to get home before midnight anyway, and so maybe it's just as well. But one of the people that he writes to is Bernard Bettman, who was head of the Board of Governors at the Hebrew Union College, and another was Rabbi Emil Hirsch, who was a radical Reform rabbi in Chicago. And this is at a time in 1890s when the Reform movement was speaking about universalism. Judaism is a universal religion. It is for everyone. Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise spoke with great conviction that by the year 1900, he was convinced all Americans were going to practice Judaism, or at least believe in the fundamentals of Jewish ethical monotheism, even if they didn't convert. And so these radical reform or classical reform, or however you want to call them, rabbis, were pouring out a sea of rhetoric talking about how Judaism is for all Americans. But when they're faced with an actual white Protestant of no Jewish background who wants to become a rabbi, then the actual situation emerges. And this actually comes back to an article that Professor Ariel wrote quite a few years ago called Miss Daisy's Planet, and you're all familiar with the reference to Miss Daisy. And Professor Ariel found a stark dissonance between what the Reform rabbis in the period that he studied, which was 1870 to 1930, were saying, and the reality that he found inside the congregations. Basically, the rabbis were saying we're all brothers and sisters, but the congregants were expressing a very ethnic, a very tribal sense of Judaism. And I think the same thing is going on today. We talk about how Judaism is a universal religion, that we're a religion, we're open to everyone, and we are to a certain degree. But so much of our identity, maybe 90% in many cases, is not based on Jewish religious principles, but rather Jewish cultural influences. Bagels and lox may be much more important than ethical monotheism. As a rabbi, that frequently disturbs me, although not on Sunday mornings when I'm eating bagels and lox. I think that what these cases seem to indicate is, and I could bring hundreds of additional cases, is that throughout the 19th century, there was a constant flow of people in and out of Judaism. Now, I didn't look at the out part because we want to be optimistic, right? The glass is half full, right? At least half full. And I stacked the deck on this, so you would have to agree with me. But we lost a lot of people. In the United States, in Germany even more. But being Jewish is hard. Being identified as Jewish is difficult. It's sometimes threatening, although we may not remember that right now. And so there's always the temptation to make things easier, or perhaps we just have no reason that seems compelling enough to us to continue. And it requires a continual active re-engagement and recommitment to say, I want to stay Jewish, because if you don't do anything, the default position is just to fall away, to fade away, and to disappear. But there was also a steady stream of people coming in, and an even larger group that wanted to come in. And some of them were allowed in, some of them were discouraged by various factors beyond the control of the community. Others were discouraged by factors that were very much under the control of the community. And you can see that the very meaning of what it meant to be a Jew was changing over the course of the century. So what it involved to convert to Judaism, or to convert and to cross that imaginary line from Gentile to Jew in, let's say, 1776, was very different than in 1876. As American Jews, as we changed our conception of Jewish religious and even more so our cultural identity, is what does it mean to be a Jew in modern America, whether that modern America is 1776 or 1876 or 1976 or 2076. And so we adopt, with an A, adapt, these new images to our expectations of not only what it means for us to be Jews, but for what it means for somebody who wants to enter the covenant to be a Jew. And so I think that by studying conversion, we can see not only what that phenomena involved, but also what it tells us about the indigenous religion of those born and raised in Judaism in a given time and place. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
about the Jewish community in Cuba, now that we're changing political steps here. I know there's a synagogue in Havana, and maybe you can
Sure.
talk about that.
Sure. I started a book on the Jews of Cuba, which is sitting on my computer, not quite finished. I think we... Okay, repeating the question is, question is, can I say a few words about the Jewish community of Cuba? And I started a long and sad story about how my book on Cuba has never seen the light of day and is sitting on my computer, but I'll mourn over that a different time. But it's a fascinating story. It's quite a different story from that of Jamaica. You have Ashkenazim coming in and Turkish Jews, Sephardim coming in World War I in that period. And so you have two communities that formed a population of somewhere around 18,000 Jews at its height before the revolution. There were, the majority of Jews, of course, were in Havana, but there were well-established communities in several other cities and many towns. And then you had the revolution. Now, when Fidel Castro first came to power, he was supported by 99% of the population, or 98%, or some very, very high percentage. Everyone except for those personally tied into Batista supported him. He was not overtly identified as a communist and was a very romantic type of freedom fighter. And the first government established by Castro was a moderate liberal government, which really had no power, but the people running it thought that they did. And so that you have to understand, because it was not a case of Fidel Castro wins, the communists are coming to power. This process took, it really only became apparent in the summer of 1960. So that would be about 18 months after he took control. And Castro controlled the army because Batista's army had disintegrated, so he who controls the army controls power. And this was not true with Michael Manley in Jamaica, who was elected prime minister. There was an independent military, and so Manley couldn't seize power because he didn't control that military. In any case, Jews started leaving in the summer of 1860, and this was, as is described in many sources, not due to any anti-Semitism, but rather the closing down of capitalism. Jews and many others were, of course, capitalists. And I remember talking to an elderly gentleman in Miami, Solomon Garazi, who described how the Castro's soldiers came into his business one day, and they said, "Give us the keys. This is now the property of the revolution. Don't take anything out of your desk, not even your wife's photo, and just go home. If the revolution wants to employ you as a worker, we will let you know." And so this happened over and over. There were several waves of nationalizations of different types of businesses and farms, and then eventually in the mid-60s, small businesses. And so most Jews fled. Not all. And so throughout the next 40, 50 years, you have 10% of the Jewish population that remained for various reasons. And one of the reasons my book is never finished is because it's very hard to get people in a communist country to tell you the whole truth. So if I ask our distinguished professors there questions, no matter how personal, I would hope that they will tell me in great detail. Now, maybe they won't, but I would hope. But in Cuba, that's just not a realistic expectation. So to give you one example, I asked one woman, "Why didn't you leave after the revolution?" So she smiles and she says, well, my parents were immigrants from Poland, and we didn't want to be refugees twice, and the weather was so nice here. Later, I found out, well, she was a really enthusiastic supporter of Castro for the first several years. Then, and only then, she smartened up, and she started to date a anti-Castro activist who was thrown into prison, and they were about to throw her in prison as well, and she just managed to keep out of big trouble. And then it was too late to leave. Then eventually, decades later, when she probably could have emigrated again, she'd lived most of her life in Cuba, so it was too late to go. So she didn't lie to me. She just left out a few crucial details. So, but, you know, if you write a book and say, well, the people that stayed because they liked the weather, I was worried that some of the critical response might be rather harsh. So today you have a small Jewish community. There's a lot of conversion. There's no resident rabbi, but there is a Spanish-speaking liberal conservative rabbi who visits about 4 times a year. It's a very, very well-organized community with the help of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. If anyone's active in that, I had opportunity to witness their activities at first hand there, and I was very impressed. I'm very skeptical of charitable institutions. Ever since I got a free upgrade on Korean Air to business class and sat next to a representative of the International Red Cross who was paying full freight on charitable expenses, but the Joint Distribution Committee seemed to be doing a tremendous job. So if you go to Cuba now with the liberalizations, I don't know exactly what it means, but if you can go on your own without a group, you can save a lot of money. The groups the prices are very jacked up, but they do show you around very well, and they put you in fancy hotels. And but it's an inspiring community. Not everything is exactly what is what you see, but that's true in any communist or post-communist society. So that's a little bit about Cuba. It's another fascinating corner of the Jewish diaspora.
It seems open to any kind of question. And if our speaker knows to tell you a lot about Judaism,
Just curious about your congregation. Curious about your congregation in Kingston, as far as African American, Caucasian, mixture.
The Spanish-Portuguese Jews are white, and we have a handful of non-white members who have converted, or I would say that that the leadership is not terribly receptive to that, and that is a source of considerable tension. And so the realities of what I believe in terms of theory and the social situation on the ground are quite different. We have our own prayer book, which is in its 6th or 7th edition, and which is a mixture of Spanish-Portuguese liturgy, Orthodox liturgy from England, and the Union Prayer Book, which is American Reform liturgy. Both of which were written between in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so it's, and then I'll just say a few more things, and then you can follow up if you like. And our synagogue is downtown. We're right opposite the Parliament. So we're on the border of Fletcher's Land, which is a garrison community. So there's a Don there, and then there's another garrison community on the other side. So it's an area where there's organized gangs, and in fact, you may have heard of Dudas, who was a famous Don, who was repatriated to, or sent to the United States about 5 or 6 years ago, shortly before my arrival. And in Jamaica, the political system is built on a very close relationship between the gangsters and the politicians. We have that in America too? Okay. But in Jamaica, it's a more literal process. And the Prime Minister Golding was very beholden to Dudas because he came from that district. And Dudas had basically been responsible for getting him elected to Parliament. And had been, because, getting out the people to vote, and each of these garrison communities are either JLP or PNP. So each neighborhood would be dominated by one political party, and the gang and the leader of the gang in that neighborhood is working closely with that political party. And so when elections come, people are offered $1,000 Jamaican. Before you get too excited, it's about $10 US to vote. And they don't tell you who to vote for, but everybody knows that that neighborhood votes for whichever party it is, and you are expected to vote for that party. And so they, if they bus 600 people from that neighborhood in, they know that maybe there'll be a couple of people just trying to show how independent they are, but they'll get 580, 590 votes for the party they want to get to. In any case, we're on the border there, and so it might be considered a very dangerous area, but in reality, because you have Dons, it's tightly controlled, and people who work for the Don just aren't allowed to go out and start shooting Jewish worshipers, or anybody, So it's actually pretty safe as long as you're not like stealing drugs from the Don, in which case, you'd be in big trouble. But we have, there was one incident about a year ago where there was a robbery at a bakery down the street, and our Friday services are 5:30 p.m., and we were just about to, it was 5:28, and there was a bat mitzvah the following week, so I had the mother of the bat mitzvah up there ready to light candles, and suddenly we hear a noise. And it took me several seconds to identify it as a gunshot. And then we hear a few more gunshots, and then we all just ducked down. And what had happened is down the street and about half block down was this large wholesale bakery, and 3 armed men had come in and demanded money. Now, it was a large wholesale bakery, so people in the back, was far from the gunmen, and they immediately pulled out their cell phones and called the police. So the police came, and the gunmen were still there, and there was a chase and a shootout. And one guy ran up the side street right next to the synagogue, and one guy ran down the main Charles Street right past the synagogue, and the third guy disappeared and escaped somewhere else. And there were 2 shootouts on different sides of the synagogue. But nobody was hurt inside, but we could hear it. And afterwards, the lady who makes the kiddush for us told me all the details about what had happened. And the bullets ended after 4 or 5 minutes, and I waited 2 or 3 minutes to see if it was really over, and then we lit the candles and went on with our service.
So this rabbi too was involved in shooting.
Yeah, you probably heard. The question was a two-part question about the waves of Jewish immigration and also about recent talks here about Jews in the Confederacy in the South and the Union in the North. And you probably saw or heard at least about the famous postcard that in the Civil War period they had, the greatest rabbis on baseball cards. And so one of them was the same Rabbi Lilienthal that I mentioned in my talk just a few minutes ago. And a Southern soldier had it. And when he heard that Rabbi Lilienthal, who was then in Cincinnati, had come out in support of the Union and against slavery, he took the card and he wrote across the picture. He said, I've had these, greatest rabbis postcards for a number of months, and yours has been one of the ones I've treasured more than a lot of the others. But ever since I heard that you're against slavery and against the Confederacy, I am horrified, and I think you're a mockery and an evil person. And I don't want to keep my possession of this greatest hits rabbi card anymore. So I'm sending it back to you. And, and he sent it to Rabbi Lilienthal, who, like a good rabbi, put it in his files. And the Lilienthal family about 15 years ago dug it out of the files and auctioned it off at Sotheby's for quite a good sum.
Okay, stop sending the rabbi cards.